Grenada, that tiny little island, it isn't nutmeg that's at stake in the Caribbean and Central America. It is the United States' national security.
In Grenada, the New Jewel movement had attempted to challenge emerging patterns of free market reform. Unemployment had dropped from 49% to 14%. The literacy rate rose to a remarkable 98%. Free healthcare and secondary education were established. Grenadans received scholarships for study abroad.
As I was teaching at Binghamton University, one of my students was actually, graduate students, was from Grenada. And when the revolution took place against the corrupt right-wing authoritarian regime, and the New Jewel movement came to power, the student asked me what he should do. I said, go back and work in your government. This is a chance to bring about some of the changes we talk about in our seminars. He went back, and the Grenadian government proceeded to implement advanced social programs, housing programs, cultivating agriculture, and generally opening the country to citizens' participation. Now, the U.S., especially the Reagan administration, was very upset with several things. One, the fact that Grenada was declaring an independent foreign policy, accepted aid from whatever country was offering it, whether it was European Union, Cuba, or what have you. And the fact that the Cubans sent a mission to Grenada to build a major airport became a pretext for Reagan to assert that this airfield was going to be a Soviet base, when in fact the funding for the Cuban construction team came from England. Nevertheless, the social changes and the independent foreign policy provoked the ire of the hardliners in the Reagan administration. The charges that Grenada was a communist base were absolutely rejected. The fact that there was a coup attempt within the Grenadian government to oust the president, Bishop, served as the detonator for the U.S. intervention.
The U.S. goes to war against the Caribbean island of Grenada. Their mission: stop a Cuban-inspired coup and rescue stranded American students.
We were just hoping that someone would come get us.
But the operation is a logistical nightmare, and troops face a determined enemy.
It's time to die.
Can U.S. forces win in this Cold War confrontation? Next.
The war in Grenada was perhaps the most lopsided conflict in recorded human history. A token force of a few hundred troops was dispersed by what the U.S. military termed Operation Urgent Fury. Unlike Guatemala, Iran, and the Congo, the resources and labor of the tiny nation were insignificant, nor did Grenada offer any real geostrategic import. Why then did they bother?
What we are watching is a four-phased operation. Phase one has been completed, the seizure of Nicaragua. Next is El Salvador, to be followed by Honduras and Guatemala. It's clear and explicit.
And there is a Caribbean domino theory that's unfolding.
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily a domino theory. I would call it a priority target list, a hit list, if you will, for the ultimate takeover of Central America.
The domino theory of communism was used throughout the Cold War as a justification for American military interventions. If one country went socialist, others would inevitably follow. This, in turn, would lead to a worldwide reduction in democracy, human rights, and freedom.
That's the way they operate. And others just parrot the communist line. On the other hand, outright gifts are only one way America aids other nations. As we constantly raise our standard of living, the spin-offs raise standard of other countries.
It is probable that many leaders and foot soldiers accepted the domino theory on its face. The problem is that statistical data proves that in the post-World War II era, the United States was the world's biggest promoter of totalitarian regimes. A study by Lars Schultz found that U.S. aid has tended to flow disproportionately to the Western Hemisphere's relatively egregious violators of fundamental human rights. An additional study by Martha Huggins, conducted in the 1990s, suggested that the more foreign police aid given by the U.S., the more brutal and less democratic the police institutions and their governments become. This seeming contradiction cannot be explained by the domino theory of the Cold War. There is, however, a rational explanation. As Washington moved to overthrow Arbenza's government in Guatemala, State Department officials warned of the new government that its agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon. Its broad social programs of aiding the workers and peasants in a victorious struggle against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises has a strong appeal to the populations of Central American neighbors where similar conditions prevail.
One of the leading themes of the Cold War has been the domino theory, what critics call the danger of a good example. And they are two different ways of perceiving what amounts to the same thing. Could call it the mafia doctrine. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience. It's too dangerous. If some small storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, the Godfather may not care about the money, but he does care about the refusal. And then it's necessary to send his goons to collect the money, but also to make an example.
To my store next Friday, I'll give you the money.
This is Friday, Babu. How many times I gotta tell you?
You keep on calling me Babu. It's Singh, motherfucker.
I'm trying to help you.
You keep on telling me I'm your friend.
Yeah.
You don't even know my fucking name.
You want me to catch a beating? I'm gonna catch a beating if I go back again like last week. See this guy? You see this guy? This guy don't want you to have the money because he wants to come back there and squash your head.
That's a guiding principle of world order. The U.S. has been far and away the dominant power in the post-Second World War era over much of the world, and it wants obedience and conformity. There's a fear, which is called the domino theory, that if one domino falls, one small country falls, it'll topple over the next one, it'll topple over the next one, and pretty soon all the dominoes will fall and you'll be in trouble. So, for example, if you have successful independent development somewhere, others suffering the same problems will ask, okay, why not us? And that's often pretty explicit in the internal record.
The objective was to prevent the dominoes from falling. The loss of Vietnam would trigger the loss of Southeast Asia.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
The domino theory is always ridiculed after the dominoes don't fall. Take, say, Vietnam, which was successful from the U.S. point of view. If a virus is going to spread contagion, what you do is kill the virus and inoculate the potential targets of the infection. And that's what the U.S. did. Destroyed Vietnam, never become an independent, successful country, modeled anyone, and installed vicious dictators in all the surrounding countries.
The actions of the ruler, President Diem, have been declared autocratic. And perhaps his personal actions are to some degree. But when one realizes the chaos he faced, the complete anarchy that existed there, it's conceivable that autocratic methods within a democratic framework were required to restore order.
The most important, of course, was Indonesia. And in 1965, General Suharto carried out a military coup which wiped out the one mass-based political party, sort of a party of the poor, killed hundreds of thousands of landless peasants, opened the country up to Western exploitation. There was total euphoria in the United States. I mean, the New York Times liberal correspondent, James Reston, called it a gleam of light in Asia. The Times knew what was happening. They described it as a staggering mass slaughter, but just magnificent. And in fact, in retrospect, George Bundy, one of the top planners for Kennedy and Johnson, National Security Advisor, in retrospect, he said he thought that we probably should have called off the war in 1965, the Vietnam War, because the region was inoculated. Indonesia was sound. No more dominoes. Not much point wasting more time in wiping out Vietnam. But there's nothing ridiculous about the theory. That's why it keeps being resurrected. The mafia principle is correct. If you want to maintain order and discipline, you have to make sure that there's no disobedience, even in the smallest place, and in particular, no successful disobedience. So yes, it's a dominant theme of world order in the hands of the United States, and in fact, its predecessors in imperial conquest.
Que los Estados Unidos tienen que respetar el derecho de los pueblos a desarrollar su economía en la forma que necesita o desea.
Nowhere was the danger of a good example more apparent than in Chile. For most Americans, the date of September 11th has only one possible connotation. Yet, for the people of Chile, the date signifies an older, deeper scar. On September 11th, 1973, the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende was overthrown in a violent coup d'etat. It established a military dictatorship run by Auguste Pinochet, which would last for 17 years, resulting in the torture and murder of thousands of citizens. At the height of the repression, Chile's soccer stadium was transformed into a concentration camp. Among those targeted was a man whose music now plays on this film's soundtrack, Victor Jara.
He was taken to the stadium, where he was a source of strength for his fellow prisoners, singing for them until soldiers beat him to the ground and smashed his hands. In his last poem, smuggled out of the stadium, he wrote, "What horror the face of fascism creates. They carry out their plans with knife-like precision. For them, blood equals medals. How hard it is to sing when I must sing of horror, in which silence and screams are the end of my song." After 2 days, they killed him.
A report of August 18, 1970 by the State Department explained, "We identify no vital U.S. national interests within Chile." Nevertheless, for Henry Kissinger and other major policy planners, Allende represented a virus that could spread contagion throughout Latin America. As an example of this virus in action, one of Allende's first acts was to guarantee school children a glass of milk every day.
We had no contact with any of the people that carried out the military coup, and therefore the coup that overthrew Allende was done without contact with the United States.
Kissinger was lying. Declassified documents reveal that the coup in Chile was directed from Washington, and that the Allende regime had been under attack even before its inception. A CIA cable of October 1970 reads, "It is firm and continuing policy that Allende be overthrown in a coup." Unlike the other governments we have discussed, Salvador Allende's regime was explicitly socialist, yet it had also been democratically elected. In short, his regime challenged the entire ideological basis of the Cold War. them be taken alive, Allende committed suicide in the Moneda Palace as fascist troops were closing in.
Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
In stark contrast to what Allende had in mind as a corrective to Chile's economic woes, Pinochet would embrace a radical program of free market forms as theorized by economist Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys. Friedman described himself as a libertarian with a small L, presenting his philosophy as a more moderate variant of the Austrian school of free market capitalism. He shared with them a vision in which virtually everything is owned. The programs entail deregulation, wage reduction, attacks against unions, elimination of social spending, and a fire sale of natural resources to transnational corporations. The Western press described the events in Chile as an economic miracle.
Economic policies that were implemented in Chile as a result of the military regime are intertwined. I mean, one cannot analyze the violence without considering the way in which these economic policies sought to be implemented. Today, Chile stands as one of the most unequal countries in the whole region. The polarization between the have and the have-nots have increased dramatically in the last 20 years, again, as a result of these neoliberal policies or globalized policies that were implemented during the Pinochet regime, which meant the privatization of pension plans, for example, for people who retire, the privatization of universities, schools, the educational system, health, and so on and so forth. So an economic miracle for whom? I mean, that's always the question that I, raise. I mean, when they talk about economic miracle, who has benefited from this economic miracle? I think that's the key question.
Thank you all very much. It's an honor for me to be here to pay tribute to a hero of freedom, Milton Friedman. He has used a brilliant mind to advance a moral vision. We have seen Milton Friedman's ideas at work in Chile, where a group of economists called the Chicago Boys brought inflation under control and laid the groundwork for economic success.
The thesis of the shock doctrine is that we've been sold a fairy tale about how these radical policies have swept the globe. That they haven't swept the globe on the backs of freedom and democracy, but they have needed shocks, they have needed crises, they have needed states of emergencies. Milton Friedman understood the utility of crisis. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around.
Milton Friedman was a leading monetarist. He was a professor of economics at the University of Chicago who believed that value came from money, in contrast to those who believe that value comes from human beings, that human beings and human labor is the source of all value. Milton Friedman believed it was money and gold, and therefore by changing monetary rates and doing fiscal policy, he was able to organize an economy. He was a free marketeer. He was a laissez-faire capitalist, a laissez-faire theorist, and that's part of his monetarism. Laissez-faire means let the market decide. Devil take the hindmost. Get as much as you can and run. This negates consumption, it negates health, it negates meeting human needs, while a few profit. This is the theory of Milton Friedman.
My feeling is that there's two different kinds of market fundamentalism. I mean, when I use the term, I use it to mean a deep faith in the power of the market, to solve economic problems and even other kinds of social and political problems. I regard it as very naive in that sense. It's almost like a kind of religious faith. The market will solve it, the market will solve it. It's okay. The market will solve it. But they also sometimes think it's benevolent. That the market will not only solve this, but it will somehow solve it in a way that benefits humanity. I mean, to me, of course, it's completely unjustified. The market doesn't give a damn how many people die. The market may solve peak oil by killing 3 billion people. There's nothing here to be worshiping. And it's type 1 market fundamentalism. Type 2 have some kind of affection for the market because they feel that it has, for example, helped them into their positions of wealth and power. The other way to look at it, which is what I usually say, is that they're not actually market fundamentalists at all. They're bullet fundamentalists. They believe in force. And the market will just be one among many things they will use. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think they're equally cynical. I think they're equally cynical about market. I don't think they really have any particular affection or romanticism for the market any more than they do for God or something. That the stupid people can believe in all these things, whether it be traditional religions or the market, and that our job is not to accept any of those naive beliefs, but to manage the society for our own benefit and possibly the benefit of others. I really don't know how often they think of themselves as altruistic. In other words, I'm not convinced that the kinds of elites we see in the US at the moment really are market fundamentalists in a very deep sense. I do think their violence and force are more their thing, and that they're quite interventionist, and that they're bullet fundamentalists.
Reaching the homeland during the late 70s and beyond, and culminating in the worldwide financial crisis, the process of globalization would demand free market reforms of virtually every country in the world. Not only did they fail to raise living standards, they resulted in greatly increased misery for the vast majority of the world's people. The escalation of deprivation indicators in Brazil and Mexico, which together account for over half of Latin America's 465 million inhabitants, revealed a miracle at work. Between 1985 and 1990, the rate of child malnutrition in Brazil increased from 12.7% to 30.7% of all children. In Mexico, the purchasing power of the minimum wage dropped 66% between 1982 and 1991. In Argentina, unemployment rose steadily in the 1980s and 90s, from 3% in 1980 to 20% in 2001, while the number of people in extreme poverty rose from 200,000 to 5 million. The economic miracle in Argentina culminated in this.
Well, Grand Area Strategy was developed really during the Second World War, and it continued to develop afterwards in the early stage of the Cold War. This is grand kind of world order planning, and most of the evidence that we have for this and the direction it took came out of the Council on Foreign Relations working group that was set up in the 1940s with the State Department called the War and Peace Studies Project. And Most of this material is now declassified and available. The documents that have come out really reveal a very kind of imperial, openly imperial mindset. I mean, the language spoke openly about establishing a Pax Americana. It talked about the necessity of transitioning away from British imperial rule to a new form of American global domination. It openly talked about limiting the sovereignty of different countries depending on their amenability to the principles of this new global economic and political order that the United States and Britain envisaged. It spoke about the need to establish international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations as mechanisms to regulate this world order, but quite openly spoke about doing this in the interests of the advanced industrial countries such as Britain, the United States and Western Europe. So on the one hand, even though there was this sense of benevolence, there was this idea that if we don't set up these institutions, there will be this international stability and there will be this danger of Nazism. There was also this quite candid admission it would protect the economic interests of a specific group of states and the interests of the colonies themselves and the kind of these countries in the less developed world that were trying to breaking out at this time, kind of struggling for national independence, that their interests were really not in the equation. And there were even references to the need to use propaganda to legitimize this whole new structure to domestic publics. So I think you can learn a lot from these documents, and it's pretty clear that the principles that they outlined, even though they certainly evolved, they changed with time, but that a lot of the basic principles have remained continuous throughout different stages in the post-war period, in the Cold War and post-Cold War period. And that within the Middle East region, that had a specific implication, which was control of Middle Eastern resources. Grand Area Strategy spoke specifically about controlling specific parts of the world to ensure US preeminence. Parts of Asia, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East. It spoke about the need to control these regions, especially due to their populations and their resources and the geographic locations.
We have all bound ourselves to work together to make sure that there is increasing happiness and prosperity for the broad masses of the people in every land, no longer subject to the hard strains of war.
An iron has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
In the background was the growing struggle between two great powers to shape the post-war world. Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
What about Soviet imperialism after the Second World War? That was real, but it was narrow. If you take a look at interventions after the Second World War, the Soviet Union did intervene in East Berlin, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, Poland, within Eastern Europe. That was their domain. They wanted to be left alone to run their own dungeon in their own domain. For the U.S., it was the rest of the world. You take a look at U.S. interventions all over the place. And the idea is, okay, we run the world, and there's a kind of like a tacit compact. We'll kind of shout at each other.
Stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
But each of us will discipline our own domains. For Russia, Eastern Europe, for the U.S., the world. And take a look at the history of the Cold War, that's what it was. It was wars against independent countries by the superpowers, almost all the U.S., because our domain is the world.